What happens when a republic tears itself apart in search of peace? When ambition, betrayal, and revenge replace the rule of law. The fall of the Roman Republic is one of the most gripping and tragic stories in human history. It is a tale of noble ideals corrupted by violence of powerful generals turning their armies on the Senate and of a young adopted heir rising from obscurity to become the master of the world. This story doesn't end with the death of Julius Caesar, it begins there. What followed was a bloody 14-year struggle for control of Rome. As friends became enemies, alliances shattered, and the fate of an entire civilization hung in the balance. This is the journey from republic to empire. If you're fascinated by history's most dramatic transformations, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sleep Stories TV. Turn on notifications so you never miss an epic chapter of the ancient world brought to life. The assassination of Caesar plunged Rome into immediate chaos when Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC. Rome was thrown into chaos almost instantly. One moment, he was standing as the undisputed leader of the republic, celebrated by some, feared by others, and the next he was lying in a pool of blood at the base of Pompey's statue, stabbed 23 times by senators he once called colleagues and friends. Those who had plunged their blades into him claimed they had saved the republic. But the moment Caesar died, so too did the illusion of unity in Rome. The Senate chambers erupted in panic. Senators, unsure whether more killings would follow, fled in all directions. The conspirators, known as the liberators, raised their bloodied daggers and shouted that tyranny had been defeated. But the only thing the Roman people saw was a group of frightened aristocrats, soaked in blood and surrounded by armed guards. To the average Roman, Caesar had been the one who brought stability after decades of civil war. His murder wasn't viewed as justice. It was seen as betrayal. Outside, the streets filled with confusion. Rumors spread like fire. Some believed a second civil war had already begun. Others thought a purge was coming. Some uninvolved senators even pretended to have taken part in the assassination, grabbing weapons and joining the liberators in hopes of avoiding suspicion or gaining power. It didn't matter. Rome, already teetering on the edge of political collapse, had lost its center. Caesar was gone, but there was no clear plan for what would replace him. Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally and co-consul, barely escaped the Senate that day. Fearing for his life, he disguised himself and hid in his home. He wasn't alone. Many prominent figures locked themselves inside, not sure whether Caesar's death meant safety or more bloodshed. Meanwhile, thousands of Roman citizens, especially veterans of Caesar's army, roamed the city in fear and anger. Many of them had fought years for Caesar. Others had just recently received land or benefits from him. To them, his assassination wasn't a noble act. It was a threat to everything they had earned. The liberators, including Brutus and Cassius, took up defensive positions on the Capitoline Hill, declaring once again that the tyrant was dead and freedom restored. But their words fell flat. The people of Rome didn't celebrate. They demanded peace. They remembered the long civil war that Caesar had brought to an end. And now it looked like violence had returned to their doorstep. In a desperate attempt to regain control, the Senate called an emergency meeting. Factions quickly formed. Some senators praised the liberators as heroes, while others condemned them as traitors. Caught in the middle, were those who simply wanted to avoid more violence. Mark Antony saw his chance. He argued that Caesar's laws and appointments should be honored, pointing out that Caesar had named many officials to serve in the coming years. If they declared Caesar a tyrant, those appointments would be void and chaos would spread even further. His argument carried weight. No one wanted a full-scale collapse of the state. In a move that shocked both sides, it was Cicero, the famous orator and defender of the Republic, who proposed the compromise. Caesar's actions as dictator would be ratified. The liberators would be pardoned. Rome would try to move forward, but it was a fragile peace built on fear and convenience, not trust. And beneath the surface, tensions only grew stronger. Antony insisted on giving Caesar a public funeral. It was here that the real turning point occurred. In front of the entire city, Antony delivered a eulogy that turned grief into rage. He read aloud Caesar's will, revealing that Caesar had left money and land to the Roman people. He showed the crowd Caesar's blood-stained toga. Then, in one final act of showmanship, he lifted a wax effigy of Caesar's body, marked with every stab wound. The crowd erupted. What followed was a riot. The Senate chambers were burned. Mobs hunted down the liberators. One man who simply shared the name Cinna with one of the conspirators was torn to pieces by mistake. Panic took hold of the city. The liberators fled, scattering in every direction, knowing that Rome was no longer safe for them. The people wanted revenge. They wanted Caesar back. And now, they looked to Antony as his heir. But Antony was not the only one who had a claim. Word soon arrived that Caesar had named a young man, just 19 years old, as his adopted son and legal heir. His name was Gaius Octavius, later known to history as Augustus. At the time, he was undergoing military training far from Rome. He had little experience, few allies, and no official power. But he had Caesar's name, and in the new Roman world, shaped by chaos that would be enough to make him a contender. Caesar's death had not saved the Republic. It had shattered it. And in the power vacuum that followed, a new generation of rivals was preparing to fight for its future. The streets of Rome had gone quiet, but only for a moment. A new storm was on the horizon. Brutus and Cassius failed to win the Roman public's support. Brutus and Cassius had imagined themselves as heroes. In their minds, the assassination of Julius Caesar would be seen as an act of patriotism, a noble defense of the Roman Republic against dictatorship. They expected crowds to cheer the Senate to praise their bravery and the people to rally to their cause. But reality struck them hard. Instead of applause, they were met with fierce suspicion and eventually outright hatred. In the days following the murder, the two men and their fellow conspirators took shelter in the Capitoline Hill, guarded by armed supporters. From this high ground, they issued statements claiming that liberty had been restored and that the Republic was safe once again. But in the streets of Rome, the atmosphere was anything but hopeful. There were no festivals, no garlands, no expressions of public joy. The people remained quiet, uncertain, and deeply uneasy. Brutus, in particular, was stunned by this reaction. He believed that his reputation as a philosopher and a moral man would be enough to convince the population of his sincerity. After all, he was a descendant of Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder of the Republic, who had expelled the last king of Rome. But blood-soaked ideals did not impress the citizens of a traumatized city. The Roman people didn't care about symbolism. They cared about security, food, land, and peace. And Caesar, despite his faults, had promised them all these things. Cassius, more pragmatic and less idealistic than Brutus, saw the warning signs early. He noticed the way people looked away as they passed, the way whispers spread at marketplaces, and how soldiers loyal to Caesar began to regroup. He urged Brutus to act more aggressively, to seize control, punish resistance, and silence Antony before he could stir public opinion. But Brutus refused. He wanted to maintain the image of lawful moral leadership. Ironically, it was this restraint that allowed their enemies to gather strength. Mark Antony, meanwhile, was working quietly but effectively. Though he had been shaken by Caesar's death, he quickly realized that the liberators had no real plan for what came next. They had killed a man, not a system. Rome was still a republic in name, but without Caesar's control, the government was paralyzed. Antony began to position himself as a defender of Caesar's legacy and the protector of public order. Through careful speeches, political maneuvering, and backroom deals, he slowly turned the Senate and eventually the people against the assassins. As the days passed, the citizens of Rome began to ask dangerous questions. If Caesar had been a tyrant, why had he been so generous? Why had he left land and money in his will for the poor? Why had the men who killed him fled and armed themselves instead, trusting the justice system they claimed to defend? The more people thought about it, the more they saw Brutus and Cassius not as liberators, but as traitors. The turning point came at Caesar's funeral, when Antony's carefully planned speech ignited a firestorm. The crowd, which had remained passive until then, exploded in grief and fury. The city rioted. The conspirators' names were cursed in the streets. Statues of Caesar were raised again in public squares. The Senate house where he had been murdered was burned down by the mob. Brutus and Cassius, once proud senators, now realized they had become fugitives in their own homeland. Faced with growing hostility and the threat of violence, Brutus and Cassius made the decision to leave Rome. It was a bitter retreat. They had entered the Senate as defenders of the Republic, but now they fled under cover of night, unsure where they could even go. Their political support had vanished. The public had rejected them. Even many of their former allies in the Senate turned away, unwilling to risk being associated with their failure. They retreated to the eastern provinces, where they still had influence and access to military resources. From there, they hoped to regroup, rebuild their forces, and one day return to Rome with enough strength to finish what they had started. But that dream was already fading. The myth of noble liberators had collapsed. Their names were now attached to disorder, betrayal, and cowardice. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Antony continued to dominate the political stage. With the liberators gone, he used their absence to justify increasing his control. He declared himself Caesar's political heir and guardian of the public good. But he also knew that another threat was on the horizon. Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, was on his way to Rome. And unlike Brutus and Cassius, this young man would not underestimate the power of public support. The assassination that Brutus and Cassius believed would save the Republic had only deepened its wounds. By failing to win the hearts of the Roman people, they had surrendered the moral high ground. Without popular support, their cause lost meaning and their position became weak. The Republic they tried to protect no longer recognized them as its defenders. And in their failure, they paved the way for a new kind of ruler, one who would not share power at all. Antony's manipulation of Caesar's funeral ignited a public uprising. Mark Antony knew exactly what he was doing. From the moment Caesar fell beneath the senators' knives, Antony began planning his next move. Unlike the conspirators, who were unsure of how to proceed, Antony understood that the path to power ran through the people of Rome, and to win them over, he would use the one weapon he still had: the memory of Caesar. The conspirators had agreed reluctantly to allow Caesar a public funeral. They hoped a peaceful ceremony would ease tensions and restore order. But Antony had other ideas. As Caesar's co-consul, he was the one expected to deliver the eulogy. He saw the event not as a memorial, but as a stage. With careful preparation, he turned a simple funeral into a masterful act of political theater, one that would shake Rome to its foundations. On the day of the funeral, thousands gathered in the forum. Citizens, soldiers, senators, merchants, and slaves filled the square. All eyes turned to the raised platform where Caesar's body lay surrounded by flowers and guarded by veterans from his legions. The mood was somber but calm. That would soon change. Antony began his speech with humility. He praised Caesar's victories, his reforms, his generosity. He reminded the crowd of the games Caesar had hosted, the debts he had canceled, the land he had given to the poor. He spoke of Caesar's conquests in Gaul, his mercy toward defeated enemies, and his vision for Rome. The crowd murmured with approval. Then Antony shifted the tone. He held up Caesar's blood-stained toga, torn and pierced by dagger wounds. He pointed to each mark, naming the senators responsible. Here, he said, Brutus stabbed. Here, Cassius struck. The crowd gasped. He then lifted a wax effigy of Caesar's body, showing the horrific injuries in full view. People began to weep, shout, curse. But Antony wasn't finished. In the final act of his performance, he revealed the contents of Caesar's will. To the astonishment of the crowd, he read that Caesar had left 75 denarii to every citizen and had granted public land to be used for parks and gardens. The man they had just buried had still been thinking of them in death. The silence of the forum broke into cries of grief and then into rage. A wave of fury swept through the masses. The people saw Caesar not as a tyrant, but as a martyr. They saw the conspirators not as saviors, but as murderers. Antony had succeeded in flipping the entire narrative. The crowd, once hesitant and afraid, now wanted revenge. The riot began almost instantly. Citizens tore apart benches, dragged wood from buildings, and created a massive funeral pyre in the forum. They burned Caesar's body there on the spot, ignoring all protocol. The flames rose high, dark smoke, billowing across the skyline. As the fire roared, the people turned violent. They ran through the streets with torches, searching for the homes of the assassins. Some broke into houses and looted. Others attacked anyone they suspected of opposing Caesar. One man, Cinna the poet, was torn limb from limb by a mob simply because he shared a name with one of the conspirators. It didn't matter that he had nothing to do with politics. In the chaos, reason was lost. Rome became a city gripped by mob justice. Antony stayed above it all, letting the people carry out the anger he had carefully unleashed. He didn't need to order violence. It happened naturally, born from pain and manipulated emotion. The liberators had no choice but to flee. They escaped Rome in disguise, heading east to gather support and prepare for war. Their dream of restoring the Republic had ended not with a triumph, but with fire and fear. In the days that followed, Antony used the momentum to secure his power. He passed new laws in Caesar's name, gained command of military units, and positioned himself as the natural successor to Caesar's leadership. He portrayed himself as the only one capable of protecting Caesar's legacy and Rome itself from further chaos. But he also knew that his position was not unchallenged, because just as Antony was rising, another figure was approaching Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and legal heir. Still a teenager, barely known to the political world, Octavian had something Antony didn't: the full weight of Caesar's name. And as news of Antony's theatrics spread, Octavian began to prepare his own entrance into the arena of Roman politics. But for the moment, Antony had won. He had taken a fragile ceremony and turned it into a revolution. With nothing but word symbols and a bloodied toga, he had transformed a silent population into an angry mob. He had redefined Caesar not as a dictator, but as a beloved father of the nation, betrayed by those closest to him. And by doing so, he had reshaped the battle for Rome before a single sword was drawn. Antony's manipulation of the funeral was not only a political masterstroke, it was the spark that lit the next great fire of civil war. Octavian returned to Rome determined to claim Caesar's legacy. When news of Julius Caesar's assassination reached Gaius Octavius, he was in the small coastal town of Apollonia, in what is now Albania, preparing for a military campaign with Caesar in the east. Only 19 years old, Octavian was not yet a soldier, nor was he known in the highest political circles of Rome. But what he held in his possession would change the course of history forever: Caesar's will. In that will, Caesar had named Octavian, his grandnephew by blood, as his adopted son and sole heir. With that simple legal statement, Octavian inherited Caesar's name, his fortune, and most importantly, his powerful legacy. From that moment on, Gaius Octavius became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And he understood, almost instinctively, what that name would mean in a Roman world torn between loyalty and rebellion. Many of his advisors urged caution. Rome was unstable. Mark Antony had control over Caesar's documents and treasury. The conspirators were still at large. Octavian had no army, no political office, and no direct allies in the capital. But he refused to wait. Against all advice, he gathered a small group of loyal friends and veterans and sailed immediately for Italy. His mind was clear. He would not beg for power, he would claim it. When Octavian landed near Brundisium, he began building support, one handshake at a time. He spoke directly to Caesar's former soldiers, promising to honor their rewards. He reminded them of Caesar's loyalty to his men and how that loyalty had been repaid with betrayal. These veterans, disillusioned by the Senate and unimpressed by Antony's ambition, began to rally behind the young heir. Soon, he had a small but growing private army at his side. As he moved north toward Rome, Octavian made sure to behave with dignity. He avoided appearing as a conqueror. Instead, he portrayed himself as the rightful son of a murdered father, returning home to mourn and fulfill Caesar's final wishes. This image resonated deeply. While Antony had stirred fury through spectacle, Octavian cultivated sympathy and quiet respect. People began to call him young Caesar, and more importantly, many began to believe that the future belonged to him. Meanwhile, in Rome, Mark Antony had grown arrogant. Having orchestrated Caesar's funeral and secured temporary control of the government, he saw himself as the natural successor. He dismissed Octavian as a child inexperienced and weak. Antony even attempted to keep Caesar's will hidden for a time, hoping to control access to the inheritance and delay Octavian's rise. But this decision would cost him dearly. Octavian, shrewd beyond his years, responded with patience and precision. Instead of confronting Antony directly, he used Rome's political tools. He allied himself with members of the Senate who had grown suspicious of Antony's growing power. Chief among these was Cicero, who, though once opposed to Caesar, now saw Octavian as the lesser threat. Cicero began a campaign of speeches known as the Philippics, relentlessly attacking Antony as a tyrant in the making. Octavian took advantage of this momentum. He publicly declared that he would carry out Caesar's will in full. He began distributing Caesar's promised payments to Roman citizens from his own purse. This was a bold move. Octavian did not yet have control of the treasury, but it earned him the love of the people. Where Antony had used theatrics, Octavian used action. Tensions between Antony and Octavian continued to rise. The Senate, divided and unsure who to trust, tried to play both sides. They appointed Antony to govern Cisalpine Gaul, a wealthy and strategic region. But when Antony attempted to take the province by force from its sitting governor, the Senate panicked. Civil war loomed once again. In response, the Senate did something unprecedented. They granted Octavian imperium, or military command, and made him a propraetor, giving him official standing to lead troops. This was unheard of for someone so young and untested. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The Senate hoped Octavian could act as their tool to weaken Antony and then be cast aside. Octavian knew better. He understood that Rome was no longer ruled by law, but by loyalty and force. He accepted the Senate's support, but he also continued to build his personal base, drawing in more soldiers, more veterans, and more allies, loyal not to the Republic, but to the Caesar name he now bore. As the year wore on, Octavian's march toward power accelerated. He was careful, strategic, and always respectful in public. He spoke of duty, of justice, and of restoring peace. But behind the scenes, he made it clear to his inner circle that he intended not to serve the Republic, but to outlive it. By the time he formally entered Rome, Octavian was no longer just a teenager with a famous name. He was a political force. The people adored him. The Senate feared him. And Antony, now isolated, realized too late that the boy he had dismissed had become his greatest rival. Octavian's return to Rome was more than a homecoming. It was a declaration. He was not coming to ask for permission to lead. He had been chosen by Caesar, by the gods, by fate. The legacy of Julius Caesar would not fade in the Forum or die on the steps of the Senate. It had taken new form in a young man with sharp eyes, steady words, and an unshakable will. And with each step Octavian took toward the heart of Rome, the Republic took another step closer to its end. Tensions escalated between Antony and Octavian over Caesar's estate. As Octavian gained momentum in Rome, the fragile balance of power between him and Mark Antony began to crumble. What had started as a cold rivalry quickly turned into open hostility. At the heart of their conflict was Caesar's vast estate, his money-land documents, and most importantly, his political inheritance. Both men claimed to speak for Caesar's legacy, but there was only room for one. Legally, Caesar's will made Octavian his adopted son and sole heir. That meant Octavian was entitled not only to Caesar's name, but also to his fortune. However, Antony still controlled the state treasury, much of Caesar's personal property, and key political connections in Rome. For weeks, he refused to release the funds that Caesar had left to the public, knowing that doing so would boost Octavian's popularity even further. Octavian did not respond with anger, at least not publicly. Instead, he made a strategic move that would define his style of leadership. He took matters into his own hands. Even without access to the treasury, he began distributing the money promised in Caesar's will, using his own limited resources, supplemented by loans and pledges from supporters. This bold act immediately won him the admiration of Rome's citizens. He was seen as selfless, determined, and above all, loyal to Caesar's word. Meanwhile, Antony's position was beginning to weaken. His power had grown too quickly, and many in the Senate had begun to see him as a threat. Cicero, now fully aligned with Octavian, launched speech after speech, accusing Antony of corruption, tyranny, and dishonoring Caesar's memory. These speeches, known collectively as the Philippics, painted Antony as a man who sought to become another Caesar, but without Caesar's discipline or vision. Antony, feeling cornered, attempted to push back. He called for the repeal of Caesar's posthumous honors, accused Octavian of manipulating the public, and demanded to be given full control over Cisalpine Gaul. When the Senate denied his request, Antony decided to act on his own. He marched his forces north to seize the province by force from the sitting governor, Decimus Brutus, ironically, one of Caesar's assassins. This move was a critical mistake. By defying the Senate and launching a military campaign without approval, Antony confirmed Cicero's worst accusations. The Senate responded by declaring Antony a public enemy and giving Octavian official command of Roman legions to oppose him. What had once been a political feud had now become a military confrontation. While Antony laid siege to Mutina in northern Italy, Octavian moved quickly to confront him. Despite his youth and inexperience, he now led an army that was loyal not to the Senate, not even to Rome, but to the name of Caesar. And with that name, Octavian rallied both seasoned generals and eager young officers who were ready to prove themselves in battle. But even as the armies maneuvered for position, the deeper conflict between Octavian and Antony simmered beneath the surface. This was not simply about money or land, it was about legitimacy. Both men wanted to be seen as the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy. Octavian had the legal documents and the support of the masses. Antony had the military experience and the loyalty of many of Caesar's old allies. Neither man was willing to yield. Antony attempted to discredit Octavian, by questioning the validity of his adoption. He argued that Caesar's will had been written under pressure, that Octavian was too young and too weak to rule. But these attacks only pushed Octavian to prove himself further. He began meeting regularly with soldiers, listening to their complaints, promising reforms, and positioning himself as a leader of action, not words. Octavian also proved to be an expert at using symbols. He staged public ceremonies honoring Caesar's memory, marched beneath banners bearing Caesar's image, and made a show of treating Caesar's veterans with deep respect. Every gesture reminded the people of who he was, not just a political figure, but Caesar reborn in spirit and name. The Senate, meanwhile, found itself trapped between the two rising giants. They had hoped to use Octavian to contain Antony, but now they feared they had created a new threat. Cicero and his allies continued to push for a full alliance with Octavian, but many senators hesitated. They still dreamed of restoring the Republic. They didn't realize, or didn't want to admit, that the Republic was already gone. In the field, tensions came to a head during the battles around Mutina. Though the fighting was fierce and losses were heavy on both sides, Antony was eventually forced to retreat. But the victory came at a price. Two of the Senate's most respected generals, Hirtius and Pansa, were killed in battle. With their deaths, the Senate lost its military leadership, and Octavian found himself in command of all the loyal legions in northern Italy. It was at this moment that Octavian made a fateful decision. He refused the Senate's orders to hand over his forces. Instead, he turned his army south and marched on Rome itself. He was not coming as a rebel or a conqueror, but as the man who had defeated Antony and who now demanded recognition for what he had achieved. Antony, though temporarily in retreat, was not finished. He regrouped with allies in the south and began preparing for the next stage of war, but he now understood something crucial. Octavian was not a boy to be dismissed. He was a rival, a dangerous one. The struggle over Caesar's estate had opened a deeper conflict. It had revealed the ambitions of two men shaped by war betrayal and a dying republic. And as both Antony and Octavian gathered power and prepared for another confrontation, it became clear that only one of them would survive the coming storm. Cicero allied with Octavian to counter Antony's rising power. Marcus Tullius. Cicero had long been one of the most influential voices in Roman politics, a brilliant orator, philosopher, and staunch defender of the Republic. He had navigated the chaos of Roman civil wars with both boldness and caution. But after the death of Julius Caesar, Cicero found himself facing a new kind of threat, one that looked eerily familiar. In Mark Antony, Cicero saw the shadow of Caesar rising again, cloaked in ambition, aggression, and military power. Initially, Cicero had welcomed Caesar's assassination. Though he had not been directly involved in the conspiracy, he believed the Republic could finally be restored. But those hopes quickly faded. The assassins had fled, and Antony had seized control of Caesar's papers, treasury, and loyal troops. Worse still, Antony had used Caesar's funeral to inflame the people and target the Senate's authority. As Rome trembled under the weight of new violence, Cicero knew that waiting passively would be fatal. At the same time, a new player was entering the political stage, Octavian Caesar's adopted son. Cicero, like many, was skeptical of the 19-year-old at first. What could a teenager barely known to the Senate possibly offer in the fight to preserve the Republic. But Octavian was not ordinary. He moved quickly, spoke carefully, and seemed to understand the complexities of Roman politics with an instinct that defied his age. Cicero saw something else too. Octavian was not yet strong enough to rule alone. He needed allies. And perhaps Cicero thought he could guide the young heir, mold him into a tool of the Senate, and use him to bring down Antony. It was a gamble, but one Cicero was willing to take. So in a move that would have been unthinkable just weeks before the old Republican statesman threw his support behind the adopted son of the dictator he once despised, their alliance was based more on necessity than trust. Cicero praised Octavian in the Senate, calling him a patriot and a true defender of Roman liberty. He encouraged others to support the young man, and he used his famous speeches, the Philippics, to launch an all-out rhetorical assault on Mark Antony. These speeches, modeled after Demosthenes' attacks on the tyrant Philip of Macedon, painted Antony as a monster, violent, lawless, and obsessed with power. Antony, enraged by Cicero's words, responded with threats and counter-accusations. He accused Cicero of hypocrisy, of betraying Caesar's memory, and of using Octavian as a puppet. But Cicero pressed on. In speech after speech, he hammered the Senate with arguments that Antony must be declared a public enemy. He demanded that the Republic act now before Antony could gather more strength. Behind the scenes, Cicero worked tirelessly to legitimize Octavian's role. He helped push legislation that granted Octavian Imperium the authority to command troops, even though he had no formal magistracy. This was a bold, even dangerous move, since it broke with Roman tradition. But the Senate was desperate. Antony was marching on Cisalpine Gaul, and Rome needed someone to oppose him in the field. For Octavian, Cicero's support was both useful and temporary. He accepted the alliance without illusions. He knew Cicero didn't truly trust him, and he didn't intend to be anyone's pawn. But for now, their interests aligned. Cicero gave Octavian credibility, and Octavian gave Cicero a weapon against Antony. Together, they pushed Rome into another war, this time framed as a battle to save the Republic from a new would-be tyrant. As the conflict escalated, Cicero's influence reached its peak. He controlled the Senate's narrative, rallied moderates, and shaped public opinion through his speeches. He even managed to isolate Antony politically by convincing key figures to abandon him. Antony, forced to lay siege to Mutina to try and hold on to power, looked increasingly like the aggressor. Cicero believed victory was within reach. But Cicero had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated Octavian's ambition. While Octavian fought Antony's forces in northern Italy, he also began expanding his own network of loyal troops. The soldiers followed him not because of Senate orders, but because of his name, Caesar. And while Cicero believed Octavian would hand over command once Antony was defeated, Octavian had no such intention. He had learned from his adoptive father that power once gained should never be surrendered lightly. After the battles around Mutina, Antony was pushed back and Cicero celebrated. But when Octavian returned victorious, he demanded recognition, not just as a military commander, but as a political leader. He wanted consulship, and when the Senate hesitated, he marched his legions into Rome. Cicero was stunned. The young man he had helped raise to power had now turned the threat of force against the very institution Cicero had sought to protect. Octavian's troops surrounded the city. The Senate was forced to concede. Octavian was elected consul, and Cicero's influence was broken. Within weeks, Octavian made overtures to Antony and Lepidus, Caesar's former lieutenant. He proposed an alliance, the Second Triumvirate. It was a shocking betrayal of everything Cicero had worked for. The alliance was sealed, and a list of enemies was drawn up for execution. Cicero's name was among the first. He had spoken too loudly, trusted too easily, and failed to see that the Republic's days were already numbered. On the run, he was eventually captured by soldiers loyal to Antony. Even in death, Cicero remained defiant. He bared his throat to the sword, offering no resistance. His hands and head were cut off and displayed in the forum as a warning to others. The alliance with Octavian had not saved the Republic. It had ended Cicero's life and helped usher in a new kind of rule, one in which military power, not senatorial debate, would decide the future of Rome. The Senate declared Antony an enemy after failed negotiations. As Rome slipped deeper into political turmoil, the fragile attempts at negotiation between the Senate and Mark Antony collapsed. Though some voices in the Senate still called for peace, the situation on the ground had moved far beyond diplomacy. By late 44 BC and into early 43 BC, the lines were drawn. The players were armed, and the hopes of compromise faded into smoke. The final straw came when Antony, defiant and increasingly aggressive, refused to heed the Senate's authority. What followed was a formal and dangerous escalation. The Roman Senate declared Antony an enemy of the state. The seeds of this declaration had been planted months earlier. After Caesar's assassination, Antony had attempted to take control of Roman politics, using his role as consul and his connection to Caesar's memory. But his moves, seizing Caesar's papers, withholding his will, using public funds to buy loyalty, made many senators nervous. They feared that Antony, like Caesar, was aiming at absolute power. And with Cicero's relentless speeches fanning the flames, the Senate became more and more inclined to take a hard stance. The crisis reached a boiling point when Antony moved his forces north to lay claim to Cisalpine Gaul. The region was under the command of Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins, but legally still a governor recognized by the Senate. Antony's siege of Mutina, the city Decimus controlled, was a direct challenge to senatorial authority. By attempting to remove Decimus by force, Antony made it clear he would not be governed by law, only by power. The Senate responded with a mixture of outrage and fear. Cicero, never one to miss an opportunity to rally the cause, used this moment to press his colleagues toward confrontation. In a fiery Philippic, he declared that Antony's behavior had gone beyond political ambition. It was treason. Antony was not acting as a Roman magistrate, he argued, but as a warlord waging civil war against Rome itself. For a brief moment, Cicero's words united the fractured Senate. Even those who had hesitated to provoke another conflict now saw no alternative. Antony had crossed the line, and unless he was checked, there would be no republic left to defend. A formal motion was passed. Antony was to be declared a hostis publicus, a public enemy. This was not a symbolic gesture. Under Roman law, declaring someone a public enemy stripped them of all legal protections. Their property could be seized. Their allies could be punished. and anyone who killed them would be celebrated, not prosecuted. It was a declaration of open war. To give weight to this decision, the Senate granted military command to two of its consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, both former allies of Caesar, but now aligned with the Republic's cause. They were ordered to march north and relieve Mutina. Octavian, too, was included in the effort, though uneasily. The Senate still didn't fully trust him, but they needed his troops and the loyalty he inspired among Caesar's veterans. The campaign that followed was brutal. Antony, entrenched around Mutina, was determined to break Decimus Brutus and secure the region. The consuls and Octavian, coordinating, reluctantly moved their legions into the field and clashed with Antony's forces in a series of hard-fought battles. Eventually, Antony was forced to withdraw, his siege broken, and his army weakened. But the price of this partial victory was steep. Both Hirtius and Pansa died from their wounds, leaving the Senate's military leadership in disarray. With the consul's dead, command of the combined Republican forces passed by default to Octavian. This shift in leadership was not what the Senate had intended. They had hoped to use Octavian as a tool, a temporary figure, to hold the line, while more experienced men controlled strategy. But now, the 19-year-old held power over tens of thousands of soldiers and was in no hurry to hand it back. Meanwhile, Antony was not broken. He retreated strategically, linking up with Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's former master of horse, and a powerful general in his own right. With this alliance, Antony began rebuilding his forces in southern Gaul. His letters to Rome were filled with angry condemnations of the Senate, accusing them of corruption, cowardice, and betrayal. He insisted that he was fighting not against Rome, but against a small clique of aristocrats who had never accepted Caesar's reforms. In Rome, the Senate attempted to maintain the upper hand. They issued decrees praising Octavian's actions, urging further offensives against Antony, and proposing new appointments to secure the provinces. But Octavian, now aware of his leverage, began to make demands. He wanted official recognition as consul. He wanted legal confirmation of his adoption and inheritance. And most importantly, he wanted full authority to pursue Caesar's assassins and avenge his father's death. When the Senate hesitated, Octavian turned his legions south. The message was unmistakable. He would no longer be the Republic's junior partner. If they refused to share power, he would take it by force. The Senate's declaration of Antony as a public enemy had been meant to preserve the Republic. In reality, it triggered the next phase of civil war and hastened the Republic's end. Octavian and Antony, though temporarily on opposite sides, were both rising beyond the Senate's control. The old institutions designed to check power through debate and legal order were helpless against armies led by men who claimed to act in the name of Caesar. Rome had made its choice. It would no longer be ruled by words and votes, but by legions and ambition. Antony's siege of Mutina ended with defeats, and lost allies. Mark Antony had gambled everything on the siege of Mutina. He believed that if he could crush Decimus Brutus and take control of Cisalpine Gaul, he would cement his position as Caesar's true successor and gain the leverage he needed to dominate Roman politics. The city, however, became more than a strategic prize. It turned into a symbol. To Antony, it represented legitimacy. To the Senate and to Octavian, it represented resistance. The siege began in earnest as Antony surrounded the city with his legions. Mutina's walls were strong, and its defenders under Decimus Brutus held out with determination. Antony expected a swift victory, but the city's resilience combined with supply shortages and harsh weather began to take a toll. While his troops dug trenches and erected camps, Rome was mobilizing against him. In early 43 BC, two consular armies, led by Hirtius and Pansa, advanced north under Senate orders. Alongside them marched Octavian, commanding his own legions, loyal to him, not to the Senate. For a time, this uneasy coalition had one goal break: Antony's siege and relieve Mutina. Communication between the three leaders was strained. Hirtius and Pansa, seasoned commanders, viewed Octavian as too young and politically unpredictable. Octavian, for his part, mistrusted their loyalty to the Senate and knew that without military victory, he could be cast aside. Antony, aware of the approaching armies, prepared for confrontation. He dug in around Mutina, reinforcing his positions and planning for battle. His strategy was to defeat the consular armies in the field before they could join forces. If he could defeat them separately, he could isolate and eventually eliminate Octavian too. But things did not go according to plan. The first major clash came at Forum Gallorum, a small village near Mutina. Antony ambushed Pansa's troops as they arrived, catching them by surprise. The fighting was intense, chaotic, and bloody. Though Antony initially gained the upper hand, reinforcements from Hirtius turned the tide. Antony was forced to withdraw. Pansa was mortally wounded during the battle, stabbed in the confusion, possibly by one of his own men. A few days later, another larger engagement occurred near the city itself. Hirtius, commanding fresh forces, launched a full assault on Antony's camps. The attack was fierce. Roman fought Roman in close combat across muddy fields and wooden barricades. Hirtius personally led part of the charge into Antony's camp, an act of bravery that cost him his life. But despite his death, the attack succeeded. Antony's forces were pushed back, their lines broken, and the siege effectively ended. Realizing his position was no longer tenable, Antony made the difficult decision to retreat. He broke off the siege and began marching west, seeking to regroup with Lepidus, who was stationed in Transalpine Gaul. It was a harsh retreat. His army was exhausted, battered by repeated assaults, and demoralized by defeat. Many soldiers deserted. Others died from hunger exposure or skirmishes along the route. Antony's once proud force was now a shell of its former self. Even worse than the military loss was the political cost. Antony had wagered his reputation on victory. The defeat at Mutina not only weakened his army, it weakened his alliances. Many who had quietly supported him from a distance now abandoned him. Some Roman nobles, who had feared Antony's growing power, now turned to Octavian instead. Even some of Caesar's former allies began to question whether Antony could carry Caesar's legacy forward. But Antony was not finished. His retreat was strategic, not total collapse. He still had loyal commanders, and he still held deep connections to veterans and provincial governors. Upon reaching Lepidus, he convinced him to join forces not through desperation, but by appealing to shared loyalty to Caesar. Lepidus, sensing that Rome was still fractured, and that Octavian could not yet fully dominate the political field, agreed. Their combined forces breathed new life into Antony's position. Together, they commanded tens of thousands of troops and controlled vast territories in the western provinces. Antony also reached out to other generals, including Plancus and Pollio, persuading them to declare against the Senate and join his side. It became clear that the conflict was far from over. Though Mutina had been a setback, Antony had recovered quickly, and he was more dangerous than ever. Back in Rome, the victory over Antony brought little celebration. The deaths of both consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, had left a power vacuum. The Senate had no generals left to lead their forces. Decimus Brutus, though technically victorious, lacked popular support. And Octavian, now the sole surviving commander of the campaign, controlled the bulk of the army. The Senate expected him to submit to relinquish his command and return to civilian status. He refused. Octavian knew that he had earned his power through blood and loyalty, not Senate approval. The soldiers followed him because of his name and because he had paid them, led them, and stood beside them in battle. He now had both the military strength and the political opportunity to reshape Rome's future. The Senate had underestimated him once before they would not be given the chance to do so again. Mutina had changed everything. Antony, though defeated, was not destroyed. Octavian, though officially only a teenager, had emerged as the true victor. The old republic had lost its last champions. The road was now open for a new kind of leadership, one forged in war, hardened by betrayal, and carried on the shoulders of Caesar's legacy. Octavian's disillusionment with the Senate led him to seize power. The Senate had always imagined itself as the beating heart of the Roman Republic, ancient, dignified, and essential. But to Octavian, freshly victorious from the campaign at Mutina, and surrounded by legions who adored him, the Senate no longer looked like a symbol of wisdom and order. It looked like a group of out-of-touch aristocrats clinging to fading power. And as Octavian waited for the Senate to recognize his victory, he watched with growing disbelief as they tried once again to sideline him. Octavian had done what the Senate could not. He had helped lift the siege of Mutina. He had rallied Caesar's veterans, coordinated with the consuls, and faced down Mark Antony on the battlefield. Yet after the deaths of Hirtius and Pansa, the Senate treated him not as a hero, but as a temporary tool, useful in war, disposable in peace. They offered him no honors, no command, and no seat at the center of power. Instead, they turned to Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins, and tried to restore him as a champion of the Republic. For Octavian, this was a personal and political insult. Not only had the Senate failed to properly reward him, they had elevated a man who had plunged a dagger into the father he revered. The message was clear. The Senate feared Caesar's legacy and would never willingly share power with his heir. That betrayal, sharp and unmistakable, became the moment Octavian's patience ended. The disillusionment that had grown quietly inside him now gave way to a new conviction. If the Senate would not give him power, he would take it. Octavian acted swiftly. He returned to his troops and spoke to them not as a senator or a general, but as the son of Caesar. He reminded them that their loyalty had earned them victory, that the Senate had failed to honor the dead consuls, and that Rome needed a strong hand to restore order. His soldiers, many of whom had served under Caesar himself, responded with enthusiasm. They didn't care about the legalities. They cared about leadership, and Octavian had proven he could lead. In the summer of 43 BC, Octavian marched south toward Rome, not as an invader, but as a commander demanding justice. His forces didn't loot or burn. They moved in disciplined formation. But the message was unmistakable. The boy general had come to claim his place. The Senate, unprepared and leaderless, had no choice but to yield. Once inside the city, Octavian demanded to be elected consul. It was a bold move. He was far below the legal age, had never held lower offices, and had bypassed every traditional requirement. But in the face of military pressure and political desperation, the Senate relented. Octavian became consul of Rome at just 20 years old, one of the youngest in its long history. With his new powers, he moved quickly to reshape the legal and political landscape. He passed laws confirming his adoption by Caesar and securing his inheritance. He ensured that all of Caesar's acts, both legal and political, were formally ratified. Most notably, he ordered that the assassins of Caesar Brutus Cassius and their allies be declared enemies of the state. At the same time, Octavian quietly purged senators who had opposed him and installed loyalists in key positions. Though he spoke publicly about restoring order and peace, every action he took concentrated power further into his hands. The Republic's old checks and balances tribunes' elections, senatorial debate were now little more than formalities. The real power flowed through the legions and the man who commanded them. Meanwhile, Antony, who had regrouped after his defeat at Mutina, sent word to Octavian. Both men understood that the Senate had tried to manipulate them. Both had been used and discarded, though they had fought each other months before they now saw value in alliance. Each had armies, each had claims to Caesar's legacy, and each knew that Rome's future would be decided not in the Senate chamber, but on the battlefield against Caesar's killers. In a move that shocked the political class of Rome, Octavian negotiated with Antony and Marcus Lepidus, forming a new political entity, the Second Triumvirate. This alliance was not informal or secret. It was a legally sanctioned dictatorship, with all three men granted extraordinary powers to make laws, raise armies, and execute enemies without Senate approval. The Triumvirate was given 5 years of unchecked authority. For Octavian, this was both a personal triumph and a strategic pivot. He had gone from an underestimated teenager to 1/3 of the most powerful ruling body in Rome. But beneath the surface of this alliance lay deep tensions. Octavian had not forgotten Antony's arrogance, nor Lepidus's opportunism. He agreed to work with them, not out of friendship, but out of necessity. The real enemy, the killers of Caesar, still controlled much of the Eastern Empire. Before Octavian could claim Rome fully, he had to avenge his father's death. Yet even as he prepared for that war, Octavian knew that the old republican world had crumbled. The Senate, once the supreme institution of Roman governance, had lost all relevance. It had failed to check Caesar, failed to control Antony, and failed to recognize the new reality that Octavian now embodied. Power was no longer debated, it was taken. And Octavian, disillusioned, and now fully aware of the Senate's limits, intended to take all of it. His march on Rome was not a rejection of Caesar's example. It was the fulfillment of it. Just as Caesar had crossed the Rubicon years earlier to defy a broken system, Octavian now crossed his own line. There would be no more compromise with tradition. The Republic was finished, and its former heir had just become its executioner. The formation of the Second Triumvirate marked a new dictatorship. The Roman Republic had always prided itself on shared governance, magistrates elected by citizens, senators debating laws, and power divided to prevent tyranny. But with the formation of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BC, that structure collapsed completely. What emerged was not a coalition of public servants, but a legally recognized, all-powerful dictatorship shared by three men: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus. For the first time in Roman history, tyranny did not sneak in through force or trickery. It walked in openly wrapped in law and was welcomed by a desperate Senate. The Second Triumvirate was formalized through a law known as the Lex Titia, passed in Rome under pressure from the triumvir's armies. This was no vague agreement between generals. It was a constitutional revolution. The law gave the three men power to make laws without Senate approval, appoint magistrates, confiscate property, and most terrifying of all, compile lists of enemies to be executed without trial. These powers would last 5 years. In effect, the Republic was suspended. Each of the triumvirs brought something to the table. Octavian had legitimacy as Caesar's heir and the loyalty of many Roman citizens. Antony had military strength and seasoned experience. Lepidus held sway over key provinces in the west and had proven administrative skills. Together, they controlled almost all of Rome's political, military, and territorial power. Their first act was not to rebuild the Republic, but to eliminate their enemies. The most infamous consequence of the triumvirate's formation was the proscriptions, a grim and calculated purge that echoed the dark days of Sulla's dictatorship. Lists of names were publicly posted throughout Rome. These were the enemies of the statesmen accused of opposing the new regime. Once on the list, a man could be hunted down and killed, his property seized, and his family stripped of rights. There was no defense, no trial, no mercy. At first, the lists targeted political opponents and wealthy elites, especially those who had sided with the Senate against Antony, or who had tried to curb Octavian's rise. But as the purge expanded, personal vendettas, financial motives, and sheer paranoia drove the process. Some men were named for their wealth, seizing their estates, helped pay for the triumvir's armies. Others were victims of old rivalries or betrayed by friends, hoping to earn favor with the new regime. The most tragic and symbolic victim was Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic. Despite having once helped Octavian gain power, Cicero had been Antony's fiercest critic, and Antony demanded his death as a condition of joining the triumvirate. Octavian, though privately reluctant, agreed. Cicero was captured while fleeing, executed on the road, and his severed hands and head were nailed to the rostra in the Roman Forum, the very place he had once delivered his most powerful speeches. His death marked not just the end of a man, but the end of free speech in Rome. The streets of Rome ran red. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, were killed. The city that had once prided itself on law and order now operated under fear and silence. Families hid their sons, neighbors turned against each other, and bounty hunters roamed the alleys with blades and names. The rule of law had been replaced by the rule of lists. But the triumvirs were not only interested in internal purges, they had larger plans. After eliminating opposition in Rome, they turned their gaze eastward, where Brutus and Cassius Caesar's assassins had raised powerful armies and seized control of much of the eastern provinces. These men posed the greatest remaining threat to the triumvirate's power. A final confrontation was inevitable. To prepare for war, the triumvirs divided the empire among themselves. Antony took control of the east with access to wealth and troops from the Greek cities and the eastern Mediterranean. Octavian ruled Italy and the western provinces. Lepidus was given Africa, a less central but still valuable region. Though they shared power, tensions between the three men were clear. Each viewed the others with suspicion, and each understood that the alliance was temporary. But for now, they needed one another. To maintain popular support, the triumvirs promised reforms. They announced plans to redistribute land to veterans, stabilize the economy, and bring peace to the provinces. But these declarations were often empty or delayed. Most of their energy went into consolidating power, crushing resistance, and preparing for war against the liberators. The Republic, once a vibrant system of public engagement, now existed in name only. Meanwhile, the Roman people adapted to their new rulers. Some celebrated the return of order, grateful that the civil war had paused, however briefly. Others lived in fear, remembering how quickly fortunes could change. The Senate, once the nerve center of Roman politics, had become largely ceremonial. Senators met, spoke, and debated, but no decisions were made without the triumvirs' consent. This dictatorship, however, was different from the rule of past tyrants. It wasn't one man at the top. It was three, locked in a delicate balance of power, each calculating the next move. Rome had not entered an era of peace. It had entered a time of armed truce, where the true war, the one that would decide the future of the Roman world, still loomed on the horizon. The formation of the Second Triumvirate was the death knell for the Republic's institutions. There would be no return to the old system. The ideals of shared rule and elected leadership had been swept aside. In their place stood three men who ruled by decree, enforced by legions, and driven by vengeance. Rome had become a dictatorship, one not hidden in the shadows, but proudly announced, legally ratified, and fueled by blood. Proscriptions across Rome led to bloodshed and mass terror. With the ink barely dry on the formation of the Second Triumvirate, Rome descended into one of the most terrifying chapters in its long history. The instrument of this horror was the proscription, a legal, state-sanctioned purge that turned the Eternal City into a hunting ground. Originally devised as a means of eliminating political enemies and consolidating power, the proscriptions quickly spiraled into a wave of mass terror, revenge, and greed. Now, no one was safe. Not senators, not businessmen, not even those with distant connections to the wrong faction. The triumvirs, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, justified the proscriptions as a necessary measure. Rome had been plagued by civil war, they argued. Peace could not return until the enemies of the new order were destroyed. On the surface, their target list was composed of those who had supported Brutus Cassius or any cause that opposed Caesar's legacy. But behind that justification lay a darker reality. The proscriptions were also a tool to eliminate rivals. settle old scores, and fund the new regime through confiscated property. Each day, new lists of names were posted in the forum. These were not mere warnings. They were death sentences. Anyone on the list could be legally killed on sight, and the killer would be rewarded financially. The victim's assets, land, houses, jewelry, even family heirlooms were seized and redistributed to the state, or more often, to those in power. Families were broken overnight. Fathers were dragged from dinner tables. Brothers disappeared into alleys and were never seen again. Sons turned in fathers to protect themselves. Friends betrayed each other to survive. The atmosphere in Rome became surreal. People walked the streets in silence, scanning the walls to see if their name or a relative's had appeared overnight. Men shaved their beards, disguised their clothes, and fled into the countryside, hoping to escape detection. Entire families committed suicide rather than fall into the hands of bounty hunters. Women bribed soldiers to spare their husbands. Children were smuggled out of the city in carts of hay and barrels of wine. The motivations for inclusion on the list were often personal. If a wealthy man owned a house someone in power wanted, he might find his name suddenly written in red ink. If a creditor refused to cancel a debt owed by a powerful figure, he could be branded an enemy of the state. If a rival had humiliated a politician in the past, the prescriptions gave a legal path to vengeance. In this climate, justice was meaningless. Fear was the only law. Even those who had once supported Caesar were not safe. Some veterans who voiced discontent over delayed land payments were added to the lists. Minor magistrates who hesitated to carry out the triumvir's orders vanished. At first, the prescriptions targeted the elite, but soon they spread to merchants, scribes, freedmen, and even slaves who had spoken carelessly. The psychological toll was immense. The forum, once a place of speeches trade and civic life, became a marketplace of death. Executioners paraded severed heads on spears as proof of their kills. These grisly trophies were displayed on public buildings, including the rostra, where speakers once addressed the people of Rome. Blood soaked the marble steps. Children passed by their fathers' faces and were told to keep walking. The most symbolic and tragic execution was that of Marcus Tullius Cicero. Despite his previous alliance with Octavian, Cicero's scathing denunciations of Antony had made him a prime target. When Antony demanded Cicero's death, Octavian did not resist. Cicero was hunted down as he attempted to flee the country. According to legend, he bared his neck to the soldiers and accepted his fate calmly. His hands and head were severed and nailed to the rostra, the same hands that had written the speeches condemning Antony. Cicero's execution shocked the Roman public, but it also sent a clear message: no one, however celebrated or respected, was beyond the reach of the triumvirate. His death marked a moral breaking point. The purge, once political, had now become openly personal. But while Rome suffered, the triumvirs grew stronger. The confiscated properties funded their armies. The terror kept potential rivals silent. Octavian used the chaos to place his supporters in key positions throughout the city and provinces. Antony, overseeing the eastern territories, secured ships, troops, and tribute from Greek cities and client kings. Lepidus, though the least powerful, expanded his influence in Africa. The three men, bound together by blood and ambition, had turned murder into governance. Outside of Rome, the proscription spread to other cities and provinces. Local officials, eager to prove loyalty or eliminate enemies, compiled their own lists. In some towns, civil war erupted as neighbors turned against each other. What had started as a political purge in the capital became a nationwide epidemic of fear. By the time the wave of proscriptions began to slow, thousands had died. The Roman aristocracy was decimated. Cultural life withered. Trust between citizens was shattered. Rome had become a city where silence was safer than friendship, and where loyalty was measured in obedience, not principle. And yet the triumvirs still faced one final obstacle. Brutus and Cassius Caesar's killers remained at large in the east, commanding vast armies and loyal legions. The Republic's last hope had not yet been extinguished. For Octavian and Antony, the bloodshed in Rome was only the beginning. The real war, the war to avenge Caesar and define Rome's future, was still ahead. The triumvirs targeted the liberators in the east at Philippi. By the year 42 BC, the Roman world stood divided. In the west, the second triumvirate, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, had secured control of Rome through force law and terror. In the east, two men still held fast to the ideals of the Republic: Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, the principal architects of Julius Caesar's assassination. With powerful armies and control of key provinces, they represented the last resistance to Caesar's legacy. But the triumvirs were determined to crush them, and their chosen battlefield would be a remote plain in Macedonia, near a small city called Philippi. Brutus and Cassius had spent months consolidating power. After fleeing Rome, they moved east, raising funds, building armies, and forming alliances with local rulers and wealthy cities. They controlled much of Greece and Asia Minor, secured naval dominance in the Aegean, and commanded over 80,000 well-trained soldiers. Though their cause, restoring the Republic, was growing weaker in the minds of the Roman people, they still held military superiority and strategic ground. Their political rhetoric focused on liberty. They claimed to be fighting against tyranny, against the concentration of power in the hands of three men. They appealed to tradition, to senatorial pride, and to those who feared another monarch would rise. But ideals alone could not win wars. As they prepared for the inevitable clash, they knew that if they lost, the Republic would vanish forever. On the other side, the triumvirs had their own challenges. Octavian and Antony led the expedition, while Lepidus remained behind to manage affairs in the west. Their alliance was still fragile. Tensions between Antony and Octavian flared regularly. Octavian, often sick and inexperienced in battle, relied heavily on Antony's military leadership. Antony, in turn, chafed at having to share command with a younger, less proven man, but both understood the stakes. If Brutus and Cassius prevailed, all they had built would fall apart. The triumvirs assembled a massive invasion force crossing the Adriatic Sea with roughly 100,000 troops. Their journey was plagued with delays and naval skirmishes as the Republican fleet, commanded by Admiral Statius, attempted to disrupt their supply lines. Despite logistical struggles and early shortages, the triumviral armies eventually landed in northern Greece and began their march inland toward Philippi, where Brutus and Cassius had entrenched their legions. The plain of Philippi offered open space for maneuvering and visibility, but posed risks for both sides. The terrain was marshy in places and bordered by mountains and rivers, which made supply lines difficult and favored the defenders. Brutus and Cassius set up fortified camps on high ground and waited for the triumvirs to make the first move. For several weeks, the armies faced each other in a tense stalemate. Skirmishes erupted near the edges of the camps, but neither side committed to a full-scale engagement. Each general hoped the other would make a fatal mistake. Supplies ran low. Morale fluctuated. The soldiers grew restless. The long wait strained leadership on both sides. Eventually, the battle began, not by careful design, but by impatience and misjudgment. On October 3rd, the First Battle of Philippi erupted when Antony launched a surprise assault on Cassius's positions. The fighting was intense and chaotic. Antony's forces managed to break through Cassius's lines, capturing parts of his camp and scattering his troops. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, Brutus fared better. He launched an offensive against Octavian's camp and succeeded in overrunning it. Octavian himself narrowly escaped capture. He reportedly hid in a marsh, or possibly fled, disguised among the wounded. Brutus's men celebrated what seemed like a clear victory, but Cassius didn't live to see it. Believing that Brutus had also been defeated and that the battle was lost, Cassius retreated to a nearby hill and took his own life rather than be captured. His suicide, based on false information, was a devastating blow. Though Brutus tried to rally the army and conceal the truth, Cassius's death shattered morale. The war did not end that day. Both sides regrouped, and for 3 more weeks, the armies held their ground, recovering, repairing, and waiting for a second clash. Brutus now commanded both armies, but the burden wore on him. He was brilliant, idealistic, but not as seasoned as Antony. His officers began to question his decisions. His troops grew tired and hungry. On October 23rd, the Second Battle of Philippi commenced. This time, Antony coordinated a multi-pronged assault, using cavalry and infantry in a concerted attack. Brutus's lines broke under pressure. Outnumbered, flanked, and surrounded, his forces collapsed in a full retreat. As the battlefield filled with smoke and screams, Brutus fled with a small band of loyal soldiers into the hills. There, after a final farewell to his friends, he fell on his own sword, choosing death over capture as Cassius had before him. The war for the Republic was over. The triumvirs had won a total and bloody victory. Over 40,000 men had died across both battles. The Republican leadership was gone. The Senate, now powerless, had no remaining protectors. The world that Brutus and Cassius had tried to save of laws, shared power, and civic freedom was gone. Philippi was more than a battlefield. It was a funeral ground for the Republic. Back in Rome, the news of victory was met with public relief, but private unease. The civil wars had ended for now, but the cost had been enormous. Octavian and Antony emerged as masters of the Roman world, but they would not share it peacefully for long. The death of Brutus and Cassius did not bring peace. It only marked the beginning of the final struggle between the two men who had once fought side by side and who would soon become bitter enemies. The Battle of Philippi crushed the hopes of the Republican cause. The dust of Philippi had barely settled when the magnitude of the defeat became clear. The Republican cause, once the dominant political tradition of Rome for nearly 5 centuries, had suffered its final, irrecoverable blow. The twin suicides of Brutus and Cassius were not just the deaths of 2 men. They were the symbolic burial of the ideals they had fought for: liberty, shared governance, and the rule of law over the rule of men. What remained of the Republic's defenders was now scattered leaderless and resigned to a world that had moved on. For many, many senators, aristocrats, and intellectuals who had supported Brutus and Cassius, the reality was grim. Those who had escaped Philippi fled to remote provinces hoping to avoid the wrath of the triumvirs. Others surrendered seeking mercy. A few, resigned to their fate, ended their own lives. The great dream of saving the Republic had not just failed, it had been decisively crushed on the open battlefield, witnessed by tens of thousands of Roman soldiers who now swore loyalty not to laws but to men. The surviving troops of the Republican armies, numbering in the tens of thousands, were given a harsh choice: join the victors or be discarded. Many, weary of fighting and eager to preserve their lives, entered the service of Octavian and Antony. The triumvirs understood that manpower, not ideology, would determine the future. Soldiers were absorbed, retrained, and rebranded not as defenders of the Republic, but as guardians of a new order. Loyalty was repurposed overnight. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate already weakened, and passive was reduced to ceremonial status. With the death of the Republic's champions, its political core became irrelevant. Laws were now made by decree. Elections were manipulated or bypassed altogether. Traditional offices like consul praetor and tribune still existed, but their powers had been hollowed out. The facade of republican governance remained, but the soul had departed. For the Roman people, the shift was both dramatic and subtle. The Republic had long been plagued by corruption, instability, and inequality. Many citizens, especially the urban poor and military veterans, saw little to mourn in its fall. They valued security, food, and land more than abstract principles. And the triumvirs, especially Octavian, understood how to appeal to those desires. By promising stability and rewarding loyalty, they filled the void left by the Republic with something more immediate: peace through control. But not all accepted this quietly. Philosophers, poets, and orators mourned the loss in private. In whispered conversations, they spoke of the glory of Cato, the courage of Cicero, and the tragedy of Brutus. They debated whether liberty could ever return, or whether Rome was now doomed to be ruled by emperors in all but name. Yet few dared speak openly. The proscriptions had shown what happened to critics. Silence became the currency of survival. Octavian and Antony returned from Philippi as victors, but also as rivals. The Republic's fall had removed the common enemy that had once bound them together. With Brutus and Cassius gone, the triumvirs no longer needed each other for legitimacy. They needed each other only as long as their alliance remained useful. Already, the seeds of future conflict were taking root. In the immediate aftermath, they divided the empire anew. Antony took the wealthy eastern provinces, including Egypt, Greece, and Asia Minor. Octavian secured control of Italy and the Western territories. Lepidus, increasingly sidelined, was given Africa and little influence. The map of Rome was now carved not by the Senate's authority, but by the personal ambitions of its three rulers. Philippi then marked not only the death of the Republican cause, but the birth of a new political world, one based on personal loyalty, military dominance, and dynastic ambition. The Republic had tried to restrain power. Now, power had broken free, and its wielders no longer pretended otherwise. In the years that followed, Roman historians would look back on Philippi with sorrow and clarity. It had been the last stand of the old ideals. The bravery of Brutus and Cassius could not mask the fact that they were outmatched, outnumbered, and increasingly out of step with the Rome that existed after Caesar. Their noble motives, however sincere, could not withstand the new forces at play. Charisma, wealth propaganda, and the ability to command armies loyal not to the state, but to individuals. Rome had changed. The people no longer rallied to slogans about liberty and the Senate. They followed men who brought victory, fed the masses, and promised peace. And Philippi had shown them who those men were. In the end, the battle was not simply a military defeat. It was the end of a political system. The Republican cause did not die in the Senate chamber or in a debate over law. It died in mud and blood on a plain in Macedonia beneath the shadows of collapsing banners and silent eagles. What came next would not be a restoration. It would be transformation, and Octavian, still in his early 20s, was already preparing for the role that would define the next age, not as a consul or a triumvir or a senator, but as the master of Rome. Octavian and Antony divided Rome's territories and clashed again. The alliance that had once united Octavian and Mark Antony was born out of necessity, not trust. At Philippi, they had stood shoulder to shoulder to crush the remnants of the Republican cause. But with Brutus and Cassius dead, and the Republic silenced, the bond between them began to fray. What remained was not a partnership, but a quiet, growing rivalry, one forged in ambition, resentment, and a shared desire for absolute power. The division of Rome's territories after Philippi was not just a political arrangement. It was the beginning of a new conflict, one that would pit former allies against each other in a final struggle for control of the Roman world. After their victory, the triumvirs met to redraw the map of the empire. The division was clear and simple on paper. Antony would govern the East, Octavian the West, and Lepidus, increasingly a minor figure, would be confined to Africa. But the simplicity was an illusion. The lines carved into the empire were laced with tension. The East, rich in grain, gold, and influence, gave Antony access to powerful client kingdoms and vast resources. The West, ravaged by years of civil war, placed Octavian in charge of Italy, overcrowded, restless, and home to thousands of soldiers still waiting for land and payment. Octavian faced immediate problems. His legions exhausted and expecting reward after Philippi demanded land. But Italy had limited territory left to distribute, and seizing land from Roman citizens was politically dangerous. Still, Octavian pushed forward. He confiscated lands across the countryside to settle his veterans, displacing countless farmers and families. The resentment grew quickly. Uprisings broke out. Cities protested. The Italian heartland was sliding toward rebellion, and Octavian was at the center of the storm. To make matters worse, Antony was thriving in the East. He was welcomed in Greece as a hero, and in Egypt, he formed a controversial and strategic alliance with Queen Cleopatra VII. Their relationship became political as well as personal. Cleopatra provided Antony with gold ships and soldiers. Antony, in turn, presented himself as a new Dionysus, a godlike figure who would rule the Eastern world with splendor and power. To many in Rome, this was deeply unsettling. A Roman general consorting with an Egyptian queen and adopting Eastern luxury was seen as a betrayal of Roman values. Octavian seized on this discontent. Though he faced troubles at home, he understood the power of propaganda. His inner circle began a campaign to tarnish Antony's image. They accused him of abandoning Rome, of becoming a puppet to Cleopatra, of planning to divide the empire permanently. Pamphlets, speeches, and staged rumors painted Antony as an Eastern tyrant corrupted by wealth and seduced by a foreign queen. Octavian, in contrast, positioned himself as the guardian of Roman tradition, a man of discipline, loyalty, and service. Tensions escalated further when Antony demanded recognition for his children with Cleopatra. He had fathered twins and later a third son, and sought to grant them titles and lands within the Roman sphere. Octavian and his supporters were appalled. They saw it as an attempt to create a rival dynasty outside Roman control. The idea that foreign children might inherit parts of Rome was intolerable to Octavian's vision of centralized authority. In response, Octavian took bold political action. He revealed the contents of Antony's so-called donations of Alexandria to the Roman people documents in which Antony had distributed parts of Rome's eastern provinces to Cleopatra and their children. Whether these documents were authentic or exaggerated mattered little. The damage to Antony's reputation in Italy was immediate and severe. The Senate, under increasing pressure from Octavian, began to shift allegiances. Antony's supporters in Rome were pushed out, silenced, or forced to choose sides. By 33 BC, the alliance had all but disintegrated. Both men retained the title of triumvirate, but the fiction of unity no longer held. Rome braced for another civil war. In preparation, Octavian made a move that would define the final stage of the power struggle. He declared that Antony had forfeited his right to rule by placing loyalty to Cleopatra above loyalty to Rome. With the Senate's backing, Octavian stripped Antony of his titles and declared war not directly on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a brilliant rhetorical strategy. Instead of presenting the conflict as another Roman civil war, Octavian framed it as a foreign threat, a patriotic crusade to protect Rome from Eastern corruption. Antony, meanwhile, prepared for war from Alexandria. He and Cleopatra amassed a large fleet, recruited soldiers from across the east, and gathered wealth and provisions for what they knew would be a decisive battle. Antony still held many loyal commanders and legions, and his naval strength was formidable. But he underestimated the growing strength of Octavian's position in the West and the power of public opinion. The world watched as the two most powerful men in Rome prepared to face each other, not across the floor of the Senate, but across the waters of the Mediterranean. The division of the empire, once imagined as a temporary solution, had become the cause of a final confrontation. There would be no more compromise, no more alliances, only war. And in that war, only one would survive. The final confrontation between Octavian and Antony was inevitable by the year 32 BC. All pretense of cooperation between Octavian and Mark Antony had vanished. The republic they once claimed to restore was now a hollow shell, and the fragile alliance forged after Caesar's death had become a distant memory. Rome was preparing for its last civil war, a confrontation not just between generals, but between visions of the future. On one side stood Octavian, young but shrewd, determined to unite the Roman world under his control. On the other stood Antony, seasoned in battle, rich in allies, and bound to Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. The conflict that had been building for years would now reach its inevitable, violent conclusion. Octavian had laid the groundwork for war masterfully. Through propaganda, political maneuvering, and calculated intimidation, he convinced the Roman people and the Senate that Antony was no longer a Roman. His relationship with Cleopatra was portrayed as proof that he had betrayed Roman values. Pamphlets accused him of drunkenness, arrogance, and worst of all, planning to make Alexandria, not Rome, the capital of the empire. He was said to have promised Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children. These accusations, while exaggerated, were effective. Octavian declared war, not directly on Antony, but on Cleopatra, a foreign queen. This allowed him to frame the conflict as one of national defense rather than civil war. It was not Roman against Roman. He insisted it was Rome against the corrupting influence of the East. This narrative unified the Italian peninsula behind him. Even those who had once supported Antony hesitated to back a war perceived as un-Roman in spirit and foreign in leadership. Antony, meanwhile, made a series of fatal miscalculations. From Alexandria, he prepared his fleet confident in its strength. He held command over large numbers of ships, seasoned Eastern troops, and the immense wealth of Egypt. Cleopatra supported him fully, contributing money ships and logistical expertise. Together, they planned a decisive engagement to break Octavian's hold on the sea and threaten the Italian coast. But Antony's forces were divided geographically and politically. Some of his officers were disillusioned. Others were unsure about fighting for a cause so closely tied to a foreign monarch. Octavian took advantage of these doubts by offering generous terms to defectors. As the weeks passed, Antony's coalition began to erode. The decisive clash came at Actium, a narrow strait on the western coast of Greece, on September 2nd, 31st BC. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant admiral, Marcus Agrippa, had already been tightening control over supply routes and encircling Antony's position. The Battle of Actium was a massive naval confrontation involving hundreds of ships and thousands of men. But from the beginning, it was a disaster for Antony. Cleopatra, stationed with her fleet in the rear, saw the tide turning and fled the battle, early retreating toward Egypt. When Antony saw her departing, he abandoned the fight and followed, leaving the bulk of his forces in disarray. His navy collapsed. Thousands were killed, captured, or surrendered. The battle wasn't just a military defeat. It was a humiliating unraveling of authority. After Actium, Octavian moved quickly. He pursued Antony and Cleopatra to Alexandria. Over the next several months, he systematically dismantled their support. Cities that had once declared loyalty to Antony now opened their gates to Octavian. Legions switched sides. Even Antony's closest allies abandoned him. In August 37 BC, as Octavian entered Alexandria, Antony made one final tragic decision. Believing Cleopatra had already taken her own life, he fell on his sword. He was carried mortally wounded to Cleopatra's side, where he died in her arms. Days later, with Octavian closing in, Cleopatra followed him in death, reportedly by snakebite, though some believe it was poison. Octavian spared their children, but executed Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, with Julius Caesar, sealing the end of any rival claim to Caesar's legacy. With Antony dead, Cleopatra gone, and Egypt under Roman control, Octavian returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. No enemy remained. No rival existed. He had achieved what no Roman had done before him: complete unchallenged control over Rome's vast empire. But Octavian did not declare himself king. He understood that the Roman people still feared monarchy. Instead, he carefully reshaped the system from within. In 27 BC, he officially returned power to the Senate, but the gesture was symbolic. In return, the Senate gave him a new title, Augustus, meaning the revered one. He retained control of the army, the provinces, and the treasury. He was princeps first among equals, but in truth, he was emperor in all but name. The final confrontation between Octavian and Antony had changed Rome forever. It ended the age of civil wars, destroyed the last hopes of the Republic, and gave rise to the Roman Empire. The Senate still met. Laws were still passed. Elections were still held. But real power now flowed from one man, and that man was Augustus. The story that had begun with the Ides of March, with daggers in the Senate and cries of liberty, had come full circle. Those who had killed Caesar to save the Republic were dead. Those who had tried to restore it were defeated. And the man who had claimed to avenge Caesar had become something even greater, the first emperor of Rome. What followed was an age of relative peace and stability known as the Pax Romana, and though blood had paved its way, it would last for generations. The Republic was dead, but in its ashes, a new world had been born, built by ambition, sealed by war, and shaped by the will of one man, Augustus. Rome's transformation from republic to empire was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow, violent rebirth. Through assassinations, civil wars, broken alliances, and masterful ambition, Octavian emerged from the bloodshed as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The ideals of liberty and shared rule were buried on the plains of Philippi and the shores of Actium, replaced by a new reality, centralized power under one ruler. Yet in this consolidation, Augustus brought peace to a fractured world, laying the foundation for 2 centuries of stability, known as the Pax Romana. What began as a tale of revenge became the story of empire. The Republic was gone, but in its place stood something enduring, magnificent, and powerful. The age of emperors had begun, and Augustus stood at its helm, not just as Caesar's heir, but as the architect of a new Roman world that would shape history for millennia to come.